When our children are struggling to fall asleep, it can have a huge knock-on impact in other areas of their lives, like how they're performing in school, how happy they are generally, and it can impact the whole family and be quite a stressful situation. Especially if you have children with autism, then this is by chance going to be something that you will have dealt with, maybe be dealing with. And if you are, I see you, it's challenging, I get it. So the question is, how common is this, and which steps can we take as parents to support our children in helping them to fall asleep more easily so that they can ultimately be happier and have more patience, more bandwidth for what life throws at them the next day. If you're new around here, hi, my name is Rhiannon Morgan. Welcome to the Real Talk with Rhi podcast. I am what my therapist refers to as queen of my neurospicy household. So I have ADHD, which I only realised last year, but yeah, I have ADHD. All 4 children of mine have autism, and my husband is not diagnosed, but it's quite widely acknowledged between us that he also has autism. How common are sleep problems with children specifically with autism? According to sleepfoundation.org, studies are indicating that between 50 and 80% of children with autism are experiencing sleep difficulties, and that's is quite a high statistic, as I'm sure we can all agree. Let me know in the comments, have your children with autism struggled with sleep? Interesting, how were they as babies? But going on to being children, when you'd imagine they'd get to the stage where they would perhaps go to bed a bit easier, sleep through the night a little bit more. Let me know down in the comments if that's something that you are finding challenging at the moment or previously. Incidentally, if you're listening to the audio version of this podcast, then you want to join in with the conversation in the comments, you can just head to the YouTube version video of the podcast, because there's both an audio and a video version, so you can join in the conversation there. Some of the common sleep problems that we can find our children with autism facing include difficulty actually falling asleep, frequent night wakings and difficulty getting back to sleep when they wake up, and then early morning wakings. And some children will do lots of these. Sometimes they'll mix them up, sometimes they'll do most of them at once, leaving you feeling like you're back in the newborn stage, which is incredibly challenging, as we all know. And I think the difference is when you have a newborn, people expect you to walk around like a zombie, and it's quite accepted that you're going to have had sleepless nights, and people offer you consideration and moral support for that. When your children are older, there is a degree of, in my experience anyway, a lack of understanding from people in your real life at the challenges that you may be facing, and that can be difficult because there's perhaps an element of judgment of, oh, why aren't they sleeping properly? Finger pointing perhaps at your parenting. I'm here to tell you that these things can happen and they can feel incredibly stressful. They can happen to all of us. They seem like they come in waves in my experience. So in my experience of my children with autism, and talking about sleep, but general things as well, I have personally found that phases that they go through of specific challenges at the time feel so rigid and they feel like they'll last forever. But then we get over that wave, and I know I can think back to specific challenges that we've had in the past with falling asleep or food or whatever, and they feel like a very distant memory now. Then those challenges resolve and perhaps a new one crops up in a different area of your life, a different area of your child's life, or with a different child. It's just a kind of a cyclical thing that if we can appreciate in the moment that as our children grow and develop, it's going to be a bit like a video game of new level, new devil, and we'll get over this thing, there'll be something else. And not to look at that in a negative way of, oh, it's always something, but to look at it in a positive way, in that as difficult as this phase is at the moment, this too shall pass. It doesn't actually mean that there'll never be any problems in the future, and there's no indication of like how long a phase will last. But I just think that knowledge of, just because autism is a lifelong thing, this phase or this specific challenge that you and your child are facing at the moment is not necessarily a lifelong thing. And I think I find that a little bit comforting in certain situations. There are a number of factors that can be impacting our children and falling asleep. One of the big ones is anxiety, and I'm dubious to use this label too much, which is perhaps a bit controversial and slightly off on a tangent from what we're talking about, but just bear with me and then we'll get back on topic. I know a lot of people are like, I don't want to label my child with autism, ADHD, whatever. And then ultimately, I think my angle on that is if my children perhaps hadn't been labelled as having autism, which they do have, and that is a lifelong thing, and that is something that's just the way their brains are wired, they might have been labelled as less so the girls, but maybe Will when he was younger, not so much now, but when he was younger, he almost definitely would have been labelled in school as challenging, difficult, busy, potentially naughty, because he wasn't being naughty, but he wasn't conforming with what traditional school rules wanted from him, and that may have been interpreted as naughty. So I don't actually think that not labelling him in that situation would have helped. However, I worry about labelling any child with something like anxiety, and obviously this is entirely up to you. I'm not a doctor, this is just language I'm using with my children, but I don't want to label one of the children, for example, as having anxiety, because I feel that is a kind of thing that can be a stage where children go through worries, and it's a very natural progression thing to go through worries as you grow up and as you become more aware of the world. I can remember quite vividly myself going through two distinct stages when we lived in a house that I left. So I can't tell you how old I was, but we left this house when I was 8 or 9 maybe, so pre-age 9. I can remember two distinct stages, one of them worrying that I was going to die, and another one worrying that my family were going to die and I was going to be left on my own. And I think this is almost like quite a natural stage to go through when children realise that life can happen and people can pass away. And I think that this stage can happen to a lot of children just as they grow and have this awareness of the world, and as long as we support them through, that's great. But if we label them in that situation as having anxiety or being an anxious child, that can almost become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, in the way that if you label a child as being naughty or difficult, they lean into that and that becomes their identity. So while a level of worrying can cause sleep issues, I am cautious not to use the term having anxiety with my children, because I don't want that to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, if that makes sense. While I do think that it can be helpful from the point of view of knowing your own brain to understand your own label, as in I'm not just weird or scatty, I have ADHD, that can be helpful. We have to be careful with labeling our children and self-diagnosing them with being anxious or a difficult sleeper or struggling to fall asleep, because these labels in themselves can add to the problem. I'm hoping that does make sense. I know that clinical anxiety and diagnoses of these things is probably a totally separate thing. So just trying to keep that distinction and not labeling problems that can then become problems. And I do see that as different as identifying that someone is neurodiverse. Anyway, back on track. Can you tell I have ADHD and keep going off on these tangents? Worries from children can really impact them falling asleep. And we'll go into that a little bit more in a second and what we can do about it. Sensory sensitivity can be an issue. So just things as simple as not being comfortable in what they're wearing. Children with autism can be a lot more sensitive to fabrics, smells, temperatures, all these kind of things. So there's a lot we can do to help with that. Ultimately, I think the biggest struggle is the vicious cycle of it all. And I think this can be true for anyone of any age that is stuck in this cycle of not being able to sleep. And it's almost the worrying about not being able to fall asleep, as opposed to just worrying about things in general and your brain racing. But worrying about things in general can be one challenge. Worrying about not being able to fall asleep, and then that being the worry that stops you falling asleep, becomes a very self-fulfilling prophecy. I know that's something that some of my children have struggled with. One of my children recently especially has really struggled with this, and it's been a really big thing about, I'm worried I'm not going to be able to fall asleep. And then that worry is causing all this feeling in their body, and it's, oh, I'm so worried about not being able to fall asleep. And then obviously all the stress hormones are flooding around, and that does not make you feel sleepy. Does not make you feel sleepy. And then the worry about not being able to fall asleep stops the sleep. And then the whole vicious cycle continues. And being stuck in that cycle, I can tell you, is no fun for the child and definitely no fun for the parent who is seeing the child upset, stressed, tired, and ultimately then as a parent, you're tired because you're up dealing with that. It's challenging. But I'm here to tell you that there are a few things that we can do and try to help our children so that we're not stuck with them in this dreadful cycle. I take it back to exactly the same strategy I did when they were small and when they were babies, looking at routine, sleep environment, sleep habits, and looking at where there could be potential problems, and then taking those one by one and throwing everything at it. Trying all the different things. This is very much my strategy with the children whenever they've got any challenges. All the things that could be causing this. What are all the potential little triggers? What are all the things that could be adding up to contribute to this problem? And how can we knock down as many of those as possible? How can we just throw everything at it, try all the different things, and let's face it, hopefully some of it will stick and some of it will work. And this strategy seems to be so far so good. I'm going to say so far so good. I'm going to share a whole bunch of these strategies with you. Some of them you may already be doing. So you're like, oh, it doesn't work. It's still not working. But there may be tweaks you can make. Some of them you may have never tried before. And quite frankly, just try whichever ones appeal to you and try whichever things you think may appeal to your children and try multiple things at once. Because let's face it, when we're sleep deprived, we're feeling desperate. And if we can come up with a plan in the cold light of day when we're not feeling at the end of our tethers, it's going to be much easier to implement when we are very tired and dealing with a stressed out child. Taking it back to basics, same way that I did when they were little and they went through any form of sleep regression or challenge and they went from sleeping reasonably well to not sleeping. And that's going back to routine and reverse engineering what you need to happen. And this is what I do for myself as well to make sure that I sleep enough, because ultimately I feel like as an adult, if I am in bed and I should be sleeping and my children have actually allowed me to sleep and I have the opportunity to sleep, I do not want to waste that time not being able to fall asleep or having poor quality sleep. So many of these tips can work for every member of the family. So working it backwards, what time do they need to get up in the morning? And then working it backwards from that, how many hours sleep does your child need? And this is going to vary from child to child. There will be actual numbers that you can Google and look up online about how many hours sleep a certain child of a certain age needs. But ultimately, that is only going to be a guide. And some children need a lot more than that. And some children, or adults for that matter, need less. And it's a human to human kind of thing. But this is something you need to establish. When they are sleeping well, how many hours sleep do they get when they get up in the morning and they are then feeling fresh and they're well rested, that they've had enough sleep for their bodies? Working it backwards from there, what time do they need to fall asleep? So if that's 8 hours, that's 8 hours before the time they need to get up would be what time they fall asleep. And working backwards from there again, what time do they need to get into bed, allowing for how much time they require to fall asleep? And then working it backwards from there again, how much time do you need to do the whole wind down bedtime routine, which yes, we all do when they're tiny newborn babies, and sometimes that slips a bit when they get older. And then going back to doing a more strict bedtime routine can really help children. Quite frankly, if you've watched any videos on YouTube about adult and morning routines and evening routines, by putting these routines in place, it helps our bodies just stick with, now it is time to sleep, now it is time to wake up. It's giving our bodies these cues to do the things we would like it to do at certain times, be awake or be asleep. When you've figured out these times, how long they're going to need to fall asleep, that's a really key one actually, because I think so many people, adults especially, make this mistake of going to bed at the time that is 8 hours, say you want 8 hours sleep, that is 8 hours before the time you want to get up. That is not the time you want to be going to bed or going upstairs to have a shower. That is the time you think, I want to be falling asleep. I need to start my bedtime routine much earlier than this. So I'm going to tell you what works for us. And it actually goes way back before even sleeping, and it goes to eating. I always said this to people that were struggling with babies and sleeping and things, the first thing to fix before the sleeping is actually the eating. So are they eating at regular times? If you've got children that are in school and you don't work shifts and you've got a reasonably regular routine, chances are you have dinner at a similar time every night, and I'd highly recommend doing that. My children actually have dinner about 2-ish hours before bedtime, but they take quite a long time to eat, and they have a full meal. If they ever wanted something to eat after that, would be available to them, but they have a very large meal at that time, and that seems to work for them. I definitely look at what they are eating, and if they're eating anything close to bedtime that's going to give them a massive sugar kick, then that's potentially going to have a negative side effect. I do remember when we went to the Magic Kingdom on the last day of our Florida trip last year, and the children were just so awake, and I was like, oh, are you just running on the magic? Is this because it's our last night here and you're so excited? And then someone in one of the comments of my videos on my Patreon was like, they literally just had candied popcorn, so it's just popcorn and sweets. They just had a massive sugar injection. That's where I was like, oh, that's why they're so awake. At the time, we were in Disney and we wanted to make the most of our last day, so that worked. But if they'd had all that just before bed, and then I was like, oh, why are they bouncing off the walls? It makes sense, doesn't it? It totally makes sense. Have a look at what they're eating and when they're eating, and make sure they're not having anything that's really going to wake them up rather than calm them down. It's worth looking at, do they have any food intolerances as well? Because maybe if they've got bad tummies or whatever, there's definitely something that you could speak to your GP about what they're eating, and maybe run some tests for allergies, that kind of thing. Because if they are struggling to digest certain foods, that will end up affecting their sleep, especially if it's the food they've had last thing before bed. Then I would just pick a time for bed that is going to be consistent. The going to start the bedtime routine and the actual bedtime to be consistent, at least Monday to Friday while they're in school. And then if you want to make adjustments on the weekend, then that can work. But for children with autism especially, the more consistent you can be, the easier that they're going to find this. Ultimately, if you read any book about morning routines and adult sleep, they're going to say the same thing. It's go to bed at the same time, wake up at the same time, because this helps our bodies. Ultimately, before we had artificial lights, as humans, our bodies were guided by our circadian rhythms, which meant that the sun would tell our bodies when it was time to be awake, and then when there's no sun, it's time to go to sleep. And the hormones and chemicals released in our bodies were dependent on this. Now we have so much artificial light that our brains and our bodies don't know to release the chemicals to say, body, wind down, it is time to go to sleep. We can look at the amount of blue light that is going into our eyeballs leading up to bedtime. So for your children, this could look like reducing screen time, or if you are letting them have screen time leading up to bedtime, if you're on an Apple device, you can activate something called night shift mode inside of the settings menu, and this will make the screen look browny if you are looking at it with this night shift mode on and it's actually daylight. The screen looks really strange, but in the evenings the color kind of makes more sense. It doesn't look so bizarre, and it stops so much blue light going into the person's eyes that's actually looking at the screen, and it's that blue light that can impact your ability to fall asleep by stopping you releasing those chemicals that help you fall asleep. Now, I know that melatonin, which is the hormone or the chemical responsible for being able to fall asleep, is something that you can, I'm not sure if it's purchased or have prescribed. I think you can purchase it over the counter in America. It is not something that is widely used here in the UK. I believe it is prescribed under consultants for children with severe sleep difficulties here in the UK, and some children have access to that medication, but I know it is not nearly as widely used or available as it is in America and other countries. If you really are very much struggling with your child's sleep, it is something you can talk to your doctor about, but I believe it's a bit of a journey to get that medication. Very interesting, actually. If anyone knows why it is so widely available in America and not in the UK, I'd be interested to know, but I just know that is the case. So we've picked our meal times, we've picked our bed times, and then we just need to set up a really lovely, really cozy wind down bedtime routine that limits blue lights. So that can look like perhaps limiting overhead lights and just using side lamps and things to just tell our children's bodies subliminally, it's wind down time, it's time to rest. This can look like bath time and shower time. Now, I personally, it's just a very personal thing, I personally find that if I try and shower just before getting into bed, that actually wakes me up rather than calms me down. A bath, fine, that will be quite relaxing. But for me, a shower is quite almost stimulating. It's almost like a waking up thing. If you are going to have your children shower in the evenings, I would personally do what I actually do, which is just shower them as early as possible in the evening rather than just before putting them into bed. And obviously, it's whatever works for your child. If your child isn't super woken up by a shower, then shower them before bed by all means. But for me personally, I find that if I shower immediately before getting into bed, I'm actually not feeling sleepy. So just little tweaks, little trial and errors really to see what's going to work for your child. But a bath is going to be a super easy one. Now, something else we've been trying lately, I'd heard so much about the benefits of magnesium for sleep for adults and children, and specifically for children. Apparently, if they're deficient in magnesium, it can have a massive impact on their sleep. So I bought this, which, apologies if you're on the audio version, I'm holding it up to the camera. It's Sleep Baby Sleep Magnesium Oil Body Spray with lavender and chamomile. I will link it below. Basically, the directions are: shake well before use, apply 30 minutes before bed, spray and massage onto legs and feet. And there's a recommended dose from children age 1 to 3, get 3 sprays, all the way up to children 11 plus, get up to 12 sprays, and like everyone in between. We've been using this for a few weeks now. And like I said, one of my children specifically was getting into this really vicious cycle of, I'm worried I'm not going to be able to fall asleep. And the worry was turning into kind of fever pitch meltdown level. And then that worry was causing them not to be able to fall asleep, which gave their brains more evidence that it was true, which it was a self-fulfilling, self-perpetuating thing. I thought, we'll give this a go. This magnesium thing sounds sciencey. If you look on the NHS website, then if you're deficient in magnesium, you can have all sorts of side effects and all things. There are certain things that could have side effects and whatever, but this seemed pretty harmless. It's magnesium and lavender. I thought, we'll give it a go. And I've got to tell you, I do not know if this is a placebo. I do not know if it is witchcraft. I don't know if it just works, but I don't care because it just works. Are my children sleeping better because I've told them that they're going to sleep better and therefore it's a placebo, but it's working? Is it the act of the fact we've taken steps to improve their evening routine? I don't know. Or is it just magic? I'm not sure. But does it matter as long as it works? This is definitely something I would recommend because so far it's worked amazingly well for us. They all love it, 2 of them anyway, love it now as part of their evening routine. Have any of you tried using magnesium with your children? Is it something that has worked for you? I know you can get it in gummies and things, but I just like the idea of spraying this on their feet. It absorbs it better, but also it just forms a really nice part of the routine. You can look at your child's actual bedroom to see if that is an environment that's going to be suitable for sleep. Is there very cluttered? Is that sort of causing them to be too stimulated? Have they got access to things that they shouldn't be using or during this wind down time that perhaps need to be taken out of the room, put elsewhere, things that are too tempting, that they're too excited to play with? Is there something they're frightened of? Is there some sort of funny shadow that looks like a monster and that something that can be moved? Is there too much natural light getting into their bedroom? At the time of filming, we're still in the depths of winter here in the UK. But certainly I know as we move into the summer, we're actually expecting our children to fall asleep way before it gets dark. So blackout curtains and things like that can be a real game changer. Now, years and years ago, I did actually have blackout blinds and things that were stuck to the windows. But one thing that does work if you're really desperate and you just need something to try tonight is tin foil. If you wet one side of tin foil and you stick it to the window, that blacks out all the light. It just works, and it's something you've probably already got in your house. So if you're desperate or if you're traveling and you need something to black out windows, then that might be something to try. What is their environment looking like? Is it dark enough? Is it calming enough? Are their sheets nice and cozy? Have they got too much stuff on their bed? Have they just got too many toys in their bed? Have they got something that they associate with sleep? Something like this that smells good. It's like, this is a trigger. The smell is a trigger to tell me to go to sleep. And it's that association of, hey, this smells like this, and now it's time to go to sleep. And that's also something that's really handy. We haven't actually tried traveling since we've tried this, but sometimes when we go to new environments, when we travel to places like an unfamiliar hotel chain or something, the children can have extra difficulties falling asleep. So having something that is a familiar smell, a familiar trigger can be, I think it's going to be a game changer anyway. Normally I would take their own pillowcases, so at least that smells like home, but I think using the spray will really work. And then which activities are they doing before bed? We've talked about like showers and baths and things. After they've cleaned their teeth, they're in their pajamas, they're in bed. Reading obviously is fantastic before bed. I personally find that if I can't fall asleep and I read a few pages of a book, a couple of pages in, I'm like, whoa, I can't keep my eyes open. So that really, really helps. Audiobooks work so well for my children. I can't even tell you. The biggest difficulty I think that they have when they get into this cycle of not being able to fall asleep, and this is the way I've explained it to them, is that you have to fall asleep. It's called falling asleep. It's like a letting going and allowing. You can't force sleep. And there's, I can't fall asleep. What if I can't fall asleep? What if I can't fall asleep? If you're forcing like that, it's not going to happen, because that's not how sleep works. You drift off to sleep. It's a very kind of allowing sensation, not a forcing. You can't force it. What I say to them when they get into this spiral of, oh my goodness, I can't fall asleep, I said, don't fall asleep then. Stop trying to fall asleep and just read. Or just the one that I say most after the reading, if that hasn't fully worked, is listen to an audiobook. You can substitute audiobook for music. Certain music, I think I had like a baby Einstein CD when they were tiny that I put on of like lullabies and things. It was like classical music and lullabies, and they associated that with sleep. You can get specific books. There is one called I think it's the elephant that wanted to go to sleep or couldn't fall asleep. And then there's a tractor that wanted to go to sleep, and all these different stories. What I would do, I would not recommend reading those actual books to your children. They're the most boring things in the whole world. But once you've read them an actual story, either if you're reading to them or they're reading to you, you put these things on and they're almost like a sleep hypnosis. And if you're using an audiobook for your children in the evening, top trick, if you put it on either 0.75 or half speed, it sounds very sleepy. So even if it's like Harry Potter walked into Hogwarts, and it's not as exciting, it's more drawn out, and it's more restful and conducive to sleep. So if you do one thing, just reduce the speed of your children's audiobooks as they're falling asleep. It's a game changer. Personally, I do something similar myself. I started listening to hypnosis tracks when I was doing hypnobirthing before having the girls. I think I hadn't discovered it with the boys, but I found that they helped me fall asleep so quickly that I thought, hey. So as soon as I was then having newborn babies, I would put one headphone in my ear, and obviously the children have things playing out loud because they're just the only ones in the rooms, but I'd have my husband in the room as well. So I'd have a headphone in one ear and be listening to a hypnosis track, an audiobook, something relaxing. You can get meditation tracks, and you can get meditation tracks for children as well. They just may not be as up for listening to them, but it's something worth trying. But you can get a meditation track, an audiobook, a sleep hypnosis, something like that. And I would listen to those just because as soon as the baby went to sleep, I'd be like, I don't want to waste time not being able to fall asleep. So I would listen to those, and still to this day, it's what I do. I listen to something that helps me fall asleep so fast. I guess I figured out it's partly because my brain's racing so much because of ADHD. That helps me for that reason. But I know that the audiobooks really help my children, and having them on that slower speed really helps too. See what works for your children. And if they're absolutely adamant, I cannot fall asleep, say, stop trying then. Just listen to the book. Just listen to your audiobook. Close your eyes and listen to your audiobook. So if the lights are dimmed or off altogether, if possible. I know not all children like sleeping in total pitch darkness, but the lower you can get the light, the more that their subconscious mind and their brains are going to be like, oh, it's time to fall asleep. So you've got nice low light. They're nice and calm. My girls like having sleepy masks. So they don't necessarily like the room to be pitch black. They like to be able to have the option to see around if they so wish, yet they sleep with sleep masks on, which obviously blacks out the light totally. So that's something that can certainly be worth a go. Then you can look at weighted blankets, which are beneficial generally for children with autism who want to feel calmer. Something about suppressing the nervous system, the feeling of being pressed in during that weighted blanket. I guess it's the way babies respond to being swaddled. And you can really just experiment with, is a weighted blanket something that's going to work for your child? Is it a specific weight of blanket, as in, do they like a fluffy blanket? Do they like a thin sheet? Is there a specific formula that works? And ultimately do the trial and the error, and then keep going with the stuff that works. And then keep reinforcing with your children, wow, you slept so well, you're looking so rested, you did so well. And maybe get them on board. It's a difficult one. It's not like something that, like with potty training, where you'd be like, certain amount of wheeze on the potty and you get stickers and you get a reward or whatever. Because it's often something the children want to do. They want to be able to fall asleep and they're very worried about it. So you don't want to do anything that's going to cause extra anxiety. However, if you can find a way to positively reward them, be like, hey, look, do you know what? If we can get you in a really good sleep habit, then we'll be able to go on that trip or do that thing, whatever it might be. And really look at long-term incentives for if they can make the effort with trying the things that you're suggesting, because that's really all you can ask for your children. You can't be like, you have to go to sleep and then I'll give you a star or a sticker or a reward or whatever. But if you're going to help me and be open to trying the things that we want to try, then that will mean we'll be able to do more things. Or maybe you could put some sort of reward system in place for them trying certain things, for being open to listen to audiobooks, for reading a certain amount. And perhaps there's other more sort of tangible things that you can tick off, perhaps for being really helpful during their bedtime routine, or clean their teeth really well, or reading a certain amount of pages every night. Maybe they get a star or a sticker for reading a certain amount of pages, or something when they reach the end of, I don't know, an audiobook. Whatever you can think of, you think might work for your child, but something that you can reward them for that isn't whether they fall asleep, because we want to take the emphasis off the fall asleep, because that's the thing they're struggling with, and focus on all the other supporting elements. Because if you can get the routine, the eating, if there's any allergy things, if there's any other problems, we can just weed out all the potential problems, then sleep will happen far more naturally and things will become much easier. Honestly, because I know that we've been through some very challenging times, and when we've gone back to these basics, we've gone back to routine, things have really improved. Now, if you're an adult struggling to fall asleep, I have got a whole podcast episode about that, where I talked about all the specific strategies for adults. So I'll link that on screen, as well as a really important podcast episode where I talked to our eldest son about the difference it made when he was diagnosed with autism and how he's finding it in his life too. So I'd love it if you check that out or hang out with me a bit more on my Patreon. Thanks so much for watching or tuning in on the audio version. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.